Fellas, one of the interesting aspects of gaming that I start to see more and more of is that development and enjoyment of games is a global phenomenon that reaches much farther than one would expect. From the typical game dev hubs of the United States or the land of the rising sun in Japan. If one were to lift the metaphorical rock of game development, they would quickly come to realize that many of our favorite experiences come from countries that many might not pay much attention to. And as someone that grew up in Alberta, Canada, this was definitely the case with some of the best RPGs of all time coming from good old BioWare over in Edmonton. But beyond that, there's a whole ass world of games that come from places that you wouldn't really expect, such as the popular Witcher games and Cyberpunk 2077 coming from CD Projekt Red in Poland, creating grounded dark worlds of fantasy or sci-fi that we sink our teeth into. There's also games on the other end of the spectrum, such as Valhalla, cyberpunk bartending action, a visual novel set in a dystopic future where you play the role of a bartender in her quest to mix drinks and change lives, which, like seeming like a Japanese game, was actually developed by my homeland of Venezuela. Hell, even one of the biggest games in the year of our Lord 2025 is Clair Obscur Expedition 33, developed by Sandfall Interactive, out of France, which takes some of the best elements of turn-based RPGs coming from Japan like Final Fantasy, and then adding on action elements with a sprinkle of that little la magie française to create an experience unlike any other, and quickly becoming a studio to look up to. But for a retrospective that is supposed to be some sort of a winter special, we have to look to parts of the world where the Ice Queen of Winter takes her grasp on the inhabitants to create some of the best experiences that makes me want to roll up into a blanket, brew up some coffee or some hot chocolate, and stave away the cold with some Kino video games. Which neatly brings us to the topic of today's video, which is one of my favorite winter video games ever, and Max Payne, developed by the fine Finns over at Remedy Entertainment, over in Finland, of course, or Suomi. And of course, since we don't really have any Finnish booze around here, because, you know, we ain't got no, none of that Karjala takas, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, you don't know what I'm saying, because very Finnish things. So today, we're just gonna take whatever's in the fridge, which is just this Lidl beer. So cheers, gang. Ooh, adds a little bit of Sisu in ya, know what I'm saying? Gentlemen, if you know me, then you knew that Remedy Entertainment and all of the fine Finns over at the studio, like the ever wonderful Sam Lake or Ilkka Viili, were going to show up one of these days. And when talking about a game that puts you into the deep pits of winter, why not the snow-soaked third-person shooter noir spectacle of Max Payne to inaugurate the sort of winter special? But as per usual, gang, we need to take a look at some of the history of Remedy Entertainment and some of the folks that make up the studio, since from its humble beginnings to where they are at now, they're one of those studios that just gets better and better with every release, eventually making creative masterpieces that are unrivaled. Remedy got its start in game development in 1995, spawned from a Finnish demo scene group at the time known as Future Crew. And for those not familiar with the demo scene, basically think of singular game devs or small groups of them making tiny bite-sized experiences into demos that they would load up into demo disc and proliferate them within their circles to hopefully get picked up by a larger company. In 1995, the fellas over at Future Crew, made up of, and I'm sorry for the mispronunciation fellas, Samuli Suvahuoko, Markus Maki, Sami Nopanen, John Kavalev, and Sami Vanhattalo, were tasked by Apogee, now known as 3D Realms, to develop a vehicular racing game with combat elements. So the gang all came together to develop Remedy's first project of Death Rally in Suvahuoko's parents' basement, but the gang believed that they needed to introduce some writing to Death Rally, And through that, one of the early Remedy's employees hired a friend of his studying English at the University of Helsinki known as Sami Anterojärvi to write the dialogue, which marks the beginning of a long journey for the writer-director Sam Lake. Five years later, we get the subject of today's video in Max Payne, a hard-boiled and hard-broiled style detective noir shooter where we take the role of the titular Max Payne, a detective for the NYPD looking to avenge his family from some no-good meanies. Max Payne would be quite the shift from the earlier Death Rally and will cement Remedy's ongoing legacy of creating singular, unique narrative experiences that frankly no one else can really match in style and in substance. And while it isn't the start, Max Payne comes pretty close to creating Remedy's habit of creating video games with mixed media, using a comic book in today's case. Naturally, Max Payne is the game that we're talking about today, so we'll get on with it a little bit later in the video. But what you guys need to understand is that this is really the start of where Remedy gets its sort of like reputation for developing fine, crafted, singular experiences that mixes a lot of mediums. After the release of Max Payne, Remedy went on to develop its sequel, Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne in 2023, and in its own way it is the start of the Remedy Entertainment classic of releasing an even more impressive, more ambitious title, taking everything they learned from the previous game and improving on it in every way, only to meet lukewarm sales from what was previously expected. Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne is one of those few titles out there that I would consider a perfect sequel, which frankly Remedy would get another one of these down the road. Perfect in the sense that it isn't literally perfect, but takes everything that made the first game great, improved on it, and fixed a lot of the problems that the first game had, this time focusing on higher fidelity, better graphics, and physics, and an even greater emphasis of the various forms of media coming together to shape the narrative, with the ending theme known as Last Goodbye being the start of the always present collaboration between Remedy Entertainment and Finnish rock band Poets of the Fall. But the lukewarm sales of Max Payne 2 led to Rockstar, who owned the IP, to develop their own Max Payne 3 and forced Remedy to look at other collaborators, which they had found in Microsoft, who were looking to create an episodic action thriller exclusive for the Xbox 360, and Remedy was looking to create something completely different from what they created with Max Payne. Revealed in 2005 and after developmental issues released in 2010 came Alan Wake, an action thriller set in the Pacific Northwest town of Bright Falls that follows Alan Wake, a writer that after supernatural events take his wife away, goes on a journey to save his wife and figure out just what in the hell is going on in Bright Falls. The new direction for the narrative allowed director Markus Mäki and Sam Lake to really dial down on some narrative elements that they had always wanted to take on, which were taking inspirations from Stephen King books and of course taking influences from the film and television director David Lynch, whose directorial style and charmingly psycho weirdness of Twin Peaks were a big inspiration to Lake.
Fellas, don't drink that coffee. You'd never guess. There was a fish in the percolator. Sorry.
Now, Alan Wake is the favorite of my properties from Remedy since it so wonderfully meets in the middle between telling a great down-to-earth narrative with the occasional Finnish strange goofiness that I honestly can't really describe properly, but you'll know what I'm talking about if you've ever heard the words perkele, satana, or vitu, or hell, even the phrase such as elämä on niin vitun paska. Which is probably what the fine Finns at Remedy were thinking when word came down from Microsoft that the episodic action thriller underperformed just like Max Payne 2, and to focus their efforts on two other projects, releasing Alan Wake American Nightmare as a sort of side project, and using the multimedia approach that Microsoft really enjoyed to create an anomaly in the Remedy library known as Quantum Break. Quantum Break's whole shtick is that they had a television program running alongside the game that took into consideration what happened in the medium and reflected it in the other. Personally, gang, I'll be real in saying that this is the game that I have had the least amount of experience in, since I've only really played the game once and I never even watched the TV show. After the completion of Quantum Break, it became the end to the collaboration with Microsoft, and Remedy would go into a period that I would consider their mercenary phase, where they strategically made partnerships with certain publishers, get their games published, rebuy the IP, and then hope for a long tail to lead into profits. And the biggest projects of this period have been 2019's Control and 2023's long-awaited sequel to Alan Wake 2, naturally. Both games I would consider some of the best work that Remedy has done in not just gameplay but also narrative design, with mixing in the multimedia aspects of their production into a singular, incredible vision that makes it feel like those games are one of a kind and Remedy a one of a kind studio that only makes these kinds of games. Now, those last two that we talked about here, I kind of went through them very quickly, and there's a reason for that, and that's because they're very recent productions. And that basically means that we will talk about them eventually, but as I always say, gang, that's a story for another day. Because today is, of course, Max Payne, and you know what's so funny? I always look at this PS2 copy of Max Payne, and it still has... let's see. There we go. You can see it clearly now. It's got this nasty, disgusting King of Trade sticker on it. It's sort of like, 5 for 20. And I haven't had the heart to peel it off because I don't want it to get damaged. But regardless, that means we need to talk about whether in the year of our Lord 2025, whether you can play this game. And the answer is absolutely. It's actually pretty easy to play right out of the box, but there's a little bit of work that we need to do. As per usual with these retrospectives, it really depends on where you want to play Max Payne, whether that be on the consoles where there were a couple of ports on the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox, or if you want to grab it on PC, with the only options being at the moment getting it either on Steam or an original CD copy. The main decider between the console version and the PC will pretty much be on how much work you want to do to get the game up and running, which compared to the few other games on our retrospective isn't actually that much work at all. Regardless, if you choose to grab it on consoles, it's as easy as putting the disc into your PS2 or Xbox and just playing the damn game. The ports for Max Payne on console, which were worked on by Rockstar Canada, are quite notorious for their lack of fidelity, cuts to entire areas, and never-ending hell of loading screens that made it seem like every other door that you go through is its own level that you have to load into. While some of the cut content isn't that egregious, with most of it being little side areas that you wouldn't even really care for, the horrible frame rate, the de-resoluted textures, and the constant loading, on the other hand, are a huge problem that causes a lot of issues when it comes to the gameplay and pacing of the experience. That could ruin it for a lot of people that are trying to get into the game. Comically enough, on my end, the PS2 port is so low resoluted that in the latter half of the game, there are these laser tripwire mines that you have to shoot to get through the level, and the laser is so thin that I could barely see the damn thing, which is compounded since I'm red-green colorblind, and it would just disappear into the ether of this low resoluted nightmare. This in turn makes for an incredible experience where I'm pretty sure I had my wonderful co-host Andrew be right beside me looking for the lasers and yelling, "Stop!" Good news though, if you want to play this sordid experience on modern consoles, then you can actually play with the PS4 and PS5 having emulated versions of the PS2 port, and Xbox One and Series consoles having seemingly much better backwards compatibility, mostly because the Xbox version of that game is based on the PC version with none of the loading screens and a much higher fidelity that the PS2 didn't have. But there is still the PC version, which, like with most of these retrospectives, is where the best experience with Max Payne can be had. It just means that you need to put a little bit of elbow grease into getting it to work, and this time around I really do mean a little bit, since it's all nicely put into one package. On the PC Gaming Wiki, there are various different packs that you can use that will do all of the fixes, such as fixing the sound, proper widescreen support, and faithful texture packs to give you the best vanilla experience that you can. Of the packs, I use Darkjay and Lethal Placebo's Complete Fix Pack, which actually has a 2025 version, and it is wonderfully bundled into an installer that makes it so stupid easy it's not even funny. Hell, even for us in ultra-wide gang, we have it pretty damn good as far as Max Payne goes. With the complete fix where the game displays properly, there isn't any stretched or messed up UI elements. And the only real problem that I have experienced is that when you load into a new chapter, the loading screen and the picture is so comically small. That, as well as some of the nightmare sequences, already have a pretty crazy field of view. And with ultra-wide, it gets to ridiculous levels where Max is comically small or huge and distorted and stretched out depending on where you're looking with the camera. I know there were a few buddies of mine that were lamenting the state of the copy of Max Payne on PC, so I'm glad to say that with these packs, it fixes and enhances pretty much everything, and for the gang out there that are more console conscious, even though this is a PC copy, I would recommend this over the 2 console versions since pretty much any potato can run a game from 2001, and it's not that damn hard to set up. As usual, links to PC Gaming Wiki's page on Max Payne and the link to Dark J and Lethal Placebo's complete fix pack are going to be linked down below in the description for all of you to use for your enjoyment. Basically, for the playability of Max Payne in 2025, we actually have it pretty damn good. All you really gotta do is install that installer with the complete fix and you're golden. So we're pretty good there. But we gotta figure out just who in the heck is Max Payne and why is he always making that face. Max Payne starts in media res with the NYPD responding to a shooting at one of the New York City's many skyscrapers at Acer HQ, a pharmaceutical company.
Investigated reported disturbance at Acer Plaza.
10-4 dispatcher, verify address.
It's Acer Plaza, repeat, Acer Plaza.
Shots fired on the rooftop. An assault in progress at Acer Plaza. Repeat, an assault in progress. It's a war zone down here. 1085 dispatcher, need additional units. Additional units now. Officer in danger. Officer in danger.
10-5, please repeat, 10-5, all units, emergency. Officer in danger, Acer Plaza, repeat, Acer Plaza, all units.
They were all dead. The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger, and then it was over.
You play the role of Max Payne, who's a detective for the NYPD trying to make his way through the world of scum and villainy of New York and to make it out at the end of the day to go home to his wife and his kid.
Life was good. The sun setting on a sweet summer's day, the smell of freshly mowed lawns, the sounds of children playing, a house across the river on the Jersey side.
But after coming home on a fateful evening, he finds his home ransacked with a nasty graffiti tag on the wall that makes a terrible sign for things to come.
Listen, someone's broken into my house. Call 911.
Is this the Payne residence?
Yes, someone's broken into my house. They're still here. You have to...
Good. I'm afraid I cannot help you.
Who is this? Hello? Michelle! Michelle!
Please! I'm gonna hurt you!
It's coming. Freeze! NYPD, drop it!
Coming! Get it!
I'm gonna hurt you. No. No, no, please, God, no.
The flesh of fallen angels!
No, 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 God, no, please, Michelle. Oh, baby. No!
The day after the funeral, Max joins his friend Alex Balder within the DEA to get to the bottom of where the mysterious drug Valkyr that the junkies were using comes from, and after 3 long years of being undercover, investigating the Punchinello crime family of the Italian mob, the DEA gets a break in the investigation and Max is tasked with going to Roscoe Street Station to meet up with Alex and get to the bottom of things. Unfortunately for Max, he finds himself in the middle of a mob bank heist using old-ass, unused subway tunnels, and after fighting through a legion of mobsters and other iterations of Italians filled with ire, he comes across good old Alex, who's about to reveal that the Valkyr case goes all the way up.
Hold it! Max! Jesus, you almost gave me a heart attack! I nearly shot you!
Alex, I'm glad to see you.
What the hell's going on? There are more corpses here than at the city morgue!
It's an armed robbery. A tunnel job straight to the Roscoe Bank vault through the old station. This is Lupino's gig?
This is Lupino's doing? Lupino's men? Really?
You sure know how to pick a place? Can you get through?
No, it's locked. We gotta get out of here. If it's Lupino, it's... Alex? Alex!
There was nothing I could do. He was dead. I could tell by the empty, accusing stare of his eyes.
With Alex dead and the murder pinned on Max, it's up to Payne to get to the bottom of the conspiracy concerning the Valkyr drug, its distribution in New York City, and who makes it. But between Max and the gates of Valhalla are a legion of never-ending New York mobsters guarding the way. Honestly, gang, it's not the craziest premise out there, but I'm gonna tell you that even though it seems rather simple, there's a lot going on under the hood for the narrative of Max Payne. But before we get to the narrative, we should talk about the presentation of this game, and man oh man, it still holds up in a lot of ways for a game that is nearly 25 years old. Presentation-wise, gang, for a game from 2001, I think with the complete fix pack updating the sound and most importantly the textures to high definition, I actually think that it holds up pretty damn well. Sure, the models are pretty static and some of the sounds are stock, but that's kind of par for the course in this time period. But with knowing the limitations that they had on hand, Remedy used some really clever tricks to help present the narrative. Prime of which is using comic book panels of friends and people from the studio to play random characters, with the most famous one being Max Payne himself, which is modeled after a pretty damn young Sam Lake, textures and all. The voice of Max Payne, on the other hand, is obviously not Sam Lake, but done by the great late James McCaffrey, who had an extensive career in films and television, but his most famous roles, and the ones that I hold the most dear, are the many characters that he voiced for the gang over at Remedy Entertainment, spanning all the way from Max Payne, Alan Wake, and Control. McCaffrey as Payne does an incredible job since he has a perfectly gruff voice, the sort of voice that runs down your throat like whiskey or sandpaper and it cuts through the air like a gunshot, but still having the subtleties of the case hitting the snow-covered ground. Some of my favorite lines that he says throughout the narrative are the many sarcastic jokes that he drops when he's surrounded or been cornered by some mobster. They're the sort of dry, sarcastic jokes that leaves behind a grin that you can hear.
I went for the hotel first. It was a sad old thing with flickering lamps and faded colors, cheap mobster punks and tired-eyed prostitutes. I walked straight in, playing at Bogart like I'd done 100 times before. The place was run by a couple of murdering mobsters with shark smiles. The Finito brothers.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the pain in the butt. Pain to the max.
You're killing me. Did you make that up yourselves or you get some wine out downstairs to come up with it?
Every single sentence that McCaffrey utters as Max Payne has such weight and gravitas to it that frankly to me the performance is timeless and pretty damn irreplaceable. Sadly in 2023, not long after the release of Alan Wake 2, McCaffrey passed away at the age of 65 from multiple myeloma, a sort of cancer of the plasma cells, and like with every person of that caliber, there's a hole left behind that no one can really fill. And while this won't be the last time that we'll talk about a McCaffrey performance in this retrospective series, it is the first time, and we really do gotta hand it out to the man because man oh man, All of the performances for James McCaffrey, whether it be in film or television or video games, are always awesome to hear. So with that, man, cheers. Your legacy will live on. But to not leave things on a dour note, we do need to talk about some other aspects of the presentation, and one of them is basically how Max Payne is a perfect little time capsule for like pre-Y2K New York City, and honestly, it's pretty damn cool what Remedy did back then. Just before the turn of the millennium in 1999, the gang over at Remedy went over to New York City, and with the help of some ex-NYPD cops, went all around the city to gather information, take photos to use for reference material, and even use as textures for a lot of the buildings used in Max Payne. But what I particularly enjoy is that playing Max Payne is like taking a time machine all the way back to Y2K New York, and you just get to take in the whole era. Stuff like the tech, the kinds of cars that they're driving around in, a lot of the billboards and whatnot, all come together to make a really convincing impression of the time period. And it's not just the look of everything that takes you back, but also the people that they used for all of the models and textures for the NPCs. Most famously, of course, is Max Payne, who was modeled after Sam Lake, but if you take a look at all of the goons, and you can obviously tell that they're just family, friends, and co-workers that they had around Remedy that they put into the game to be various junkies, pushers, and mafioso deadbeats. Which makes it kinda comical because you have all of these Italian-American accented actors doing voices for mobsters that are modeled after frickin' Yarpi from Lamperanta, only for the voice actor to say something like, "Hey, so the boss says you got some sort of Sisu. Is that like a meatball sandwich or something?" Like, no joke, fellas, some of these people are so damn Finnish looking that I almost feel bad mowing these guys down in a hail of gunfire. It's almost like taking all of my dear Finnish and Estonian friends and shooting their asses in slow-mo or throwing a Molotov cocktail on them because they wail too funny and just being like, "Oh brother, I can't do it no more." Basically around this sort of time in the year, it's a time where we're always looking back when winter kicks in and it gets cold, you gotta start wearing the hat. Even though here in Italy I don't wear the hat too often, but it's one of those times, especially around Christmas time, that we tend to look back, and we look back with nostalgia. And Max Payne is just one of those where you get to look at like pre-Y2K New York with all of the goons, and especially I love how we get to see how quaint Remedy was at that point, where instead of all the goons that they could get, they just grabbed like people from the studio, and it's like, "Hey, you want to be a mafioso goon?" And they don't even speak any Italian or English. They're probably just, like, "Oh, perché la satana," classic old Finns. So it's kind of fun to do that. But we got to move that aside and pick up our dual Berettas, because right now we got to talk about the slow-mo, hard-boiled and hard-broiled gameplay that is Max Payne. And man, oh man, it's a lot of fun, but it does have a few little annoyances. Max Payne, for those unaware, plays like many of the third-person shooters of the era, but if I recalled for 2001, the game had several different aspects to the design that for today we might take for granted, prime of which are some of the mechanics surrounding the shooting and the level of interactivity in the environment. To start, we'll talk about the interactivity, since for a game all the way back from 2001, you didn't really in a shooter see it unless it was in an RPG or in an immersive sim like the original Deus Ex. In Max Payne, you could open cabinets and lockers to find ammunition or painkillers to stem the bleeding, while also having fun flushing toilets, turning the TV on and off, listening to the fabulous Lords and Ladies program, or even something as simple as turning on the vibrating bed in a sleazy brothel. Just don't bring the black light around. But there's many more aspects of the world design that make it all the more real, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that the visuals looked and ran great for the time. For example, we already talked about how they literally photographed large swaths of scummy New York, but when you add that to the models and start to add in other effects, it can still look really great in a lot of ways. One such area to me is all the little things that can happen when a shootout happens in Max Payne, which is of course runs the gambit of bullets literally flying, Molotovs getting tossed to set fire to nasty junkies, and spent casings hitting the ground and sounding so damn crisp that I almost feel like I could reach down and pick up that shotgun shell or that 9mm case. Like, I remember vividly at the beginning of the game in Roscoe Street Station that when you get into your first firefight, one of my stray bullets hit the wall behind the goons and didn't just leave a really convincing bullet hole for a concrete wall, especially for the era, but it also had like a little particle effect that chipped away in such a manner that it really impressed me. And it needs to be reminded once again that we're talking about a game from 2001. And that's just one example. Throughout the whole game, there were a ton of little sequences that really impressed what Remedy could do with the tech of the era, and a showcase of what they would be able to do in the future with games like Control or Alan Wake 2. Now that we got the interactive environments out of the way, we should probably actually talk about the core of the gameplay of Max Payne, which is the dual Beretta, wielding, gun slinging, jumping out of the way, dodging gameplay of basically shooting people. Playing through Max Payne, you go about it into 3 acts that then get divided into individual chapters that have you going from nasty, unused subway tunnels, low-life New York slums where you can just smell the opium stank off of the local junkies, high-rise pharmaceutical skyscrapers, and even a bar or concert venue known as Ragnarok, with surely the symbolism of which will come in handy later. Meanwhile, on the PS2 version, these levels are then split into even smaller sections where the door behind you would just close sometimes, and then a whole new loading screen will come in, which usually happens every 5 or so seconds, making it a real friggin' slog to get through. The objectives of going through these levels are all pretty simple and can be summed up by just reaching the end of a level and interacting with a person or some sort of object, and then you will continue on, but it is of course the mobsters that you will wipe out by the dozens between these 2 points that make the journey a fun romp. The selection of tools at your disposal range from simple pistols like the classic Beretta 92 that you can then dual wield for maximum coolio effect, then jumping up to even nastier hardware like pump-action shotguns or Desert Eagles, and eventually reaching the gambit of an M16 rifle or a sniper for those pesky far-off goons eating their pizza pies on the moon. But an overall aspect of Max Payne that I don't see mentioned too much, and one that I friggin' love, is that unlike most shooters of the era, and really most modern shooters in general, all of the weapons in Max Payne are projectile based, which means that when you pull the trigger on your Beretta, there is a physical bullet that leaves the barrel, flies through the air, and hits a poor Lamperantaleri right in the neck, causing him to fly back in pain and anguish as if he's on a wire yelling, "Oh!" The projectile-based shooting might not seem like something to make a big deal out of, since when we usually think of games with projectile-based shooting, we think of the ancient boomer shooters where a piece of plasma runs down the map to melt some cacodemons. But in Max Payne, it enhances the gameplay in ways that are really subtle but make it an enjoyable ride. Prime of which is that your enemies' weapons are also projectile based, so when a firefight ends up happening, it's not just a matter of putting the cursor on the enemy and blasting him, but also doing so in such a way that the bullet will actually hit him, since if he moves around, there's a chance that he could move past the bullet. This is then compounded when it is in your best interest to as well be moving around to try and dodge the, so to speak, mobsters' bullish bullets. So in the end, you're running around, they're running around, and bullets are flying all over the place, and it makes every single firefight a sort of dynamic thing that's always fun to go through. And on top of that, you can jump to the side while putting lead down range or doing slides backwards to make your body slimmer, and it actually does a whole lot in making you less prone to getting hit by the goons. That is, if you can defeat all of them before you hit the ground, because the second you hit the ground and you have to slowly get back up, you're going to be getting a whole lot of lead put into your stupid ass, so a bit of calculation is required to get through these firefights, but man oh man, it's always glorious. Hey, but don't get your gnocchis in a knot, gang, because there's one last big aspect that we need to talk about, and that is, of course, the bullet time that can be found in Max Payne that, while not the first thing to do it, it is one of the first games that really did it well. And it's one of those things where you put the bullet time on, slow that time down to the pace of where Neo takes his shits. The second part of what makes Max Payne such a dream to play through is the new for the era bullet time mechanic that would have Max slow his reflexes down to milliseconds, so he could precisely shoot off his dual Berettas in a hail of gunfire and get the drop on these jive turco turkeys. This mechanic is balanced out with an hourglass that continually drains while you are in bullet time, with the most draining maneuver being using your bullet time while standing. Meanwhile, if you shoot dodge in all directions, you'll drain that gauge a lot slower. Though, that comes with the disadvantage that I mentioned before, that you might get yourself in a position to get your ass wiped, or even comically fall out of a ledge like I have done a couple of times. Refilling this gauge is pretty easy, since all you have to do is dispatch some goons and it will start refilling that gauge again, with more goons being killed in succession, filling the gauge quicker as a result. But either way, bullet time makes for some really cool shooting when you get into a pickle. But what makes the game so genuinely fun and really, gang, I have to say, still really impressive all these years later, is that when you combine all of the elements of the projectile shooting, throwing out actual bullets, the bullet time, slowing everything down, and Max dodge shooting off to the side like he's some sort of weird Finnish extra in a John Woo film, bullets whizzing by, narrowly missing him, and your own creating these little streams of cold steel that eventually wipe out the enemy goons, with the usual final one getting blasted away, knocked back like he was being tugged on by a flywire. You put all those together and it can be such a genuine treat to experience. Then you turn off bullet time, it fast forwards to the real time that you're at, and all the cases fall down and plink on the floor, with the last body making its rugged fall to the ground with an iconic wail. So, with that, gang, now that we got a good chunk of the gameplay out of the way, how about we figure out just what in the hell the gameplay is all about and let Max Payne do the talking.
Punchinello's trio was done for.
Man, oh man, gang. It's still crazy how a quarter of a century later, Max Payne is still an absolute blast to play through. Just make sure you're hovering over that F5 key to quick save, because there's not a whole lot of autosaves going on. But regardless, it's still a blast to play through. No pun intended. But there is a Chow Yun Fat sized elephant in the room that we gotta talk about, and man oh man, it's gotta do with the influences of Max Payne. Some people say that it's ripping off a lot of other things. Some people think they're just simple homages, but either way, gang, we gotta talk about some cinema. Max Payne is one of those titles that from a quick glance it seems to be a rather basic hard-boiled noir detective tale about getting revenge against the ones who killed Payne's family. But the deeper and deeper that you dig into the game, you'll start to notice that the things that influenced Remedy during the development of Max Payne are numerous and incredibly varied. Since at the moment we're talking about the gameplay, I think we should talk about the cinema that influenced Remedy, and in that regard, the most obvious out of all of them are the many wonderful Hong Kong-based action movies from the 80s and 90s, most specifically the cinema of John Woo. Woo Yu-sen, also known as his anglicized pen name John Woo, is straight up one of the best film directors of action cinema of all time, and his films are incredibly cinematic experiences to enjoy. Starting with a lot of martial arts, kung fu films in the 70s, but by the time we get to the 80s, we reach the period of action cinema that he is most known for, with his frequent collaborations with Hong Kong actor Chow Yun-fat, releasing such incredible films as A Better Tomorrow, The Killer, Once a Thief, and probably the most influential for Max Payne, in Hard Boiled. These films are characterized with noir, Hong Kong stories of cops going in to get revenge against fallen comrades, triad contract killers looking to retire or atone for what they have done, and many more that take a look at the Hong Kong underworld in a way not too dissimilar to how Max Payne takes a look at New York during a snowstorm, but we'll leave that for later. What really comes through, and you can easily see this in Max Payne, is the influence of the action of Woo's films. The way that he can film a gunfight that feels more like a ballet or a musical instead of just a random shoot 'em up. What with his actors jumping and sliding while blasting away slides on the guns, racking back and forth to the percussive beat of bullets flying in slow motion, and having them hit objects and glass shattering to a billion pieces, or slamming into unsuspecting goons and splattering squibs all over the place. And you can see this in the way that Max slides and jumps out of the way to a hail of gunfire, only to release his own tempest against the mobster goons and Valkyr junkies looking to stop his rampage of revenge against those that wronged him. Personally, a sequence that really reminds me of Max Payne is a sequence in Hard Boiled, which I might add is probably the closest to Max Payne in tone, where there is a single long ass take of our protagonist going through a hospital and blasting triad goons left and right, with some of them seemingly coming out of friggin' nowhere. This sequence itself is worth the price of finding a copy and enjoying Hard Boiled, but this scene more than any other feels like Max Payne, since there are literally goons that pop out of nowhere every corner that the gang so effortlessly blast through, and by the end of it, it feels like they vanquished a friggin' army. Lastly, we'll briefly talk about what seemed like an obvious influence back in 2001, but in consideration for how long the game took to come out and that it was in development before the film even got released, let's say a few words on the most famous of films with bullet time, and that is of course The Matrix, written and directed by the Wachowskis. We already know what The Matrix is about, so I'm not going to waste your guys' time on something that we all know, but I will say that even though Max Payne came after the release of The Matrix in 1999, the game and the film were pretty much in development concurrently, and apart from some pretty cheeky homages near the end of the game, there's really not a whole lot that Max Payne actually takes from The Matrix. But there's still like 10 million mods that try to make Max Payne into The Matrix, so it's one of those things that personally, while being different things, they do absolutely complement each other. And if you like one, there's no reason not to try out and enjoy the other. Both The Matrix and Max Payne are pretty friggin' cool, I'm just gonna say. Now that we got those other elements out of the way, we should probably talk properly about the narrative of Max Payne, because it's one of those games where it might just seem like a simple noir story, but actually it's got a lot of stuff going down in the hood that I think is pretty damn cool. An aspect of Max Payne that always seems to catch me off guard, and with every replay I get to enjoy more and more, is not just the idea that the game is pretty clearly based on Norse mythology, especially the idea of Ragnarok and the Twilight of the Gods, but more so that there's so many different stories to see within the game. When we meet Max as the player, we pretty much meet a man who has already lost it all, and through his work in the DEA, especially in the events of this game, we come to find a man that is completely damned, which is a sentiment that they go into more detail in the second and third Max Payne games. But in the first game, especially with this last playthrough, that on top of all the 2-bit mobster characters like Vinnie Cogniti, the Finito brothers, Angelo Punchinello, and even characters like Vladimir Len or Mona Sachs, that the city itself really felt like a character all of its own. By the time that the game begins at Roscoe Street Station, there are murmurs that a historic snowstorm is on its way to New York City, and sets up the entire feel of the game, which is one of urban desolation, with most of the sane and good inhabitants of the city taking shelter in their homes, while the scum of the earth and those that rule over there move in the open shadows. The allusions to Ragnarok, the world-ending winter that brings about the twilight of the gods, is pretty clear, and I'll get into that into spoilers, but to me I was always wondering, since the city itself felt like a character, it was always a question of whether the city was on the side of evil or on the side of Max and his quest for vengeance, or that New York City was perhaps a sort of neutral observer and the many denizens that inhabit the city feeling more like animals without free will, just following in their nature. In this way, New York City actually comes across a lot closer to the sort of urban desolation and decay that you would get something from, like, say, Sin City or Condemned Criminal Origins, or hell, even The Crow, and while it doesn't get to the heights of those games or films, Max Payne really does a great job in creating this sort of idea that the world is ending in a way. There's no good people to be found, and what remains are the sort of people that make deals with the devil so frequently that they might as well have their own special stamp in hell for the contract. And you see that everywhere. The streets are empty with nobody in sight, the brothels aren't even full of the sorts of people that would give out their services or the ones that request them. There's only pimps and kingpins left behind desperately trying to get rid of Max for their Italian Finnish overlords, and within the broken, rundown slums of the worst that New York has to offer, all there are left are the infinite legions of catatonic Draugr, hoping for their moment that Valkyr takes them to Valhalla. There's certainly more to be said about New York City as a character itself, but for now we should probably talk about the titular character of Max Payne and what he has to do with the narrative before, we end up going into spoilers and all that, but let's talk about some Max Payne. Gang, there is something to be said that every time we start one of these games that the narrative always starts at the end. Quite literally, the first quote that we get from Max is about him shooting the final shot and getting his finger off of the trigger, since it's all over, and it is through this framing that the relationship between the player and Max differs. While I won't go into specifics as to not spoil things, I will say it is this framing that separates Max as just a simple XP from the player into his own defined character that we will come to figure out is more in control of things than we ever will be. And it's that lack of control to me that really amplifies this feeling of fatalism that you feel throughout the game. A calling card of a lot of noir and neo-noir stories are that in the end, most of the events of what happened in the narrative were out of control of the protagonist. In the case of Max Payne, it's no different, and really, that applies for everyone. I will say, gang, that if you are looking for just a John Woo shoot-'em-up gun ballet simulator, then you're going to absolutely find that in gameplay. But in narrative, you're going to find something else entirely if you really want to go digging. The irony, of course, is that if you want to see it as a simple vendetta mobster tale, then you can. But just like a lot of these noir stories that Max Payne is inspired by, the deeper and deeper as the player looks, the more strange things become, and the more that the thing that we started playing as will start to come across as something else entirely. Either way, gang, if you want to go into Max Payne playing the game as some sort of like Finno-Italian ethnic cleansing game, and that's it, then you can go into it completely fine and you'll find that. But of course, like a lot of these noir games, there's always something a little bit more for you to scrape your finger at. So just like that letter that comes across a detective's desk that gets him into a whole lot of trouble, we have a choice here, and the choice is either you can hop off the video and go play the game and figure it out for yourself, or continue down into the rabbit hole of this video and see what we got to do. Basically, gang, what I'm saying is that we're going to be reaching the spoiler section here, and so if you want to go into this game completely blind, if you haven't played it, and I absolutely do recommend that you go play it, here's a timestamp right here that will get you through to the end of the video so you can have my final thoughts and everything like that. But for everybody else, we will be going on, so I'll leave you at that. Alrighty, everybody good? Everybody hopped off? Oh, okay. So, alrighty, gang, we gotta figure out just what the hell is going on in New York City. And to do that, grab yourself a syringe full of Valkyr and shoot that up right into a vein, because man, oh man, where this trip is taking us, it's taking us to friggin' Asgard. As I've already stated, the general plot of Max Payne really isn't that complex, since it can be seen as a series of events that lead to the ultimate conclusion that we found ourselves in at the beginning of the game, which I guess if you frame it that way, then every single story is kind of like that, but whatever. And to do that, to get to the end, we have to go through various levels of the Italian mafia in New York City. Well, we do know that there is a designer drug known as Valkyr going through the dregs of society that causes vivid hallucinations, increased pain tolerance, and after a period of time, extreme mental deterioration, to the point that the users might as well have become zombies. And it is through the Valkyr case that all the strings and all the ties will be revealed. The New York City underworld is heavily involved in the distribution of Valkyr, and so Max will need to go through the lowliest of underbosses to the big Don himself in the Punchinello crime syndicate, and in that journey meet a series of interesting characters, of which we meet in the first act of the game, in dilapidated subway tunnels, Jack Lupino's hotel that serves as a brothel, and a junkie bin. And getting to the point where we just follow the trail of junkies, blood, and tears to Jack Lupino's club, Ragnarok. Jack Lupino is the underboss of Angelo Punchinello, in charge of the Valkyr racket in New York City, and through it we come to learn a variety of different aspects of not just the state of the New York underworld, but also what the drug tends to do with those that abuse it. Which at this point we only really encountered the junkies that are near catatonic and the ones we find at the beginning of the game at the Payne residence. When we enter the Ragnarok Club, we're met with a grisly scene, a sacrificial altar, various books on the occult, and slain bodies around the place that make us think that there might be something more occult going on. But apart from some connections to Norse mythology, we can chalk this one up to illicit Valkyr use, since throughout the level we find Jack Lupino ranting and raving about eating the flesh of fallen angels and how the end of the world is bound to happen.
Jack Lupino was crazy, all right.
Mythic wolves, let loose to devour the sun and the moon. Lupino is the wolf. I'm Mr. Beast, the big bad Fenris wolf. I'm the end of the world man, wearing the flesh of fallen angels.
After Y2K, the end of the world had become a cliche. But who was I to talk? A brooding underdog avenger alone against an empire of evil, out to right a grave injustice. Everything was subjective. There were only personal apocalypses. Nothing is a cliche when it's happening to you.
We also start to see that Punchinello is not very pleased with the state of affairs, having received letters from Lupino's right-hand man, Vinny Cognitti, about the deterioration of Lupino and how he has to control the entire racket himself, showing that Valkyr is starting to burn down the mob from the inside out. From this point, it doesn't take long for Lupino to show himself in a final drugged-up boss battle of sorts. After evoking the names of Astaroth, Beelzebub, Asmodeus, Baphomet, Lucifer, Loki, Satan, Cthulhu, Lilith, and Hela. Whew, man, that's quite a mouthful. Which in the end, doesn't matter, since we end up wiping his ass out anyways with some superior firepower. Though unfortunately for Max, this is not where the trail ends for the Valkyr case, and his ultimate plan of revenge against those that killed his family, since it's pretty clear that the Valkyr case goes all the way up than some two-bit kingpin, especially with the introduction of a new lead.
When Lupino finally went down, I wanted to make real sure he'd stay that way. He was a bad monster, turned them into friggin' zombie demons from outer space.
I think he's dead already.
Huh? And that's when it happened.
But dead or not, you've got the wrong guy.
In stepped this knockout femme fatale holding a gun to my face. I returned the favor. Lisa Punchinello. Lisa Punchinello was the Don's wife.
Mona Sachs, Lisa's evil twin.
Your safety's off, evil twin. You might hurt someone with that gun of yours.
Lisa's the damsel in distress. I'm the professional. I'd blow you away without batting an eye.
Sure, and you can check out my credentials splattered all over this joint.
Jack couldn't have framed you, not the state he was in. We're after the same slime bag. Angelo Punchinello's the one who murdered your friend and framed you with it.
You know this for a fact.
I've got my sources.
I don't have a clue these days. I just shoot them as they come. Who put a contract on the Archfiend?
This one's mine. I hate the guts of that sadistic wife-beater. Why not pool our bullets for this one?
I thought you'd never ask. My finger was starting to twitch.
How do you like your whiskey?
One thing I really like about Jack Lupino's character is that when you enter Ragnarok, it's one of those things where like there's tomes all over the place and it's kind of got like this sort of dour, mysterious sort of mood, and it kind of makes you think of whether or not there's actually something more supernatural going on. Like, he's evoking all these names, there's all these tomes, but basically at the end of it, you just figure out that he's just another friggin' 2-bit junkie that you gotta pump him full of holes that's just deranged on Valkyr. And I really like that little detail because it's like dealing with actual real life junkies. But at this point we start to figure out that the Valkyr case goes all the way to the top and there's a lot more that we gotta go through. But before we go through that, we gotta deal with some of Max's demons. Unfortunately, this party won't last too long since Mona slips a little Cosby special into Max's drink and he gets thrown into a hallucinogenic nightmare, which is where he'll be going into in between acts, where we get to see what torments him inside of his twisted mind. Typically, it should just look a little wonky, but because I'm playing the game in ultrawide, the FOV is so comically back that in order to actually see what's going on, you have to either look at the floor or look up in the ceiling. But anyway, these nightmares typically consist of levels that try to warp your perception of unreality with Dutch angles, seemingly endless hallways of the old Payne residence, and eventually trails of blood that hover over an abyss as deep and as dark as the ocean. The only other detail in these nightmares are the endless crying of a baby and the wailing and pleading of Max's wife apologizing for what has happened, always there just out of reach to eternally torment poor Max. That being said, from a gameplay perspective, these nightmare sections tend to get old pretty damn quickly since the novelty wears off really quickly when you end up figuring out that all you have to do is some pretty shoddy platforming in an endless abyss while you have a baby wailing in your ear. But from a narrative perspective, there's some interesting aspects to be had. I think there's something to be said that these are the few times that the player actually ends up having a more intimate relationship with Max Payne in the way that before and after in the reality of the world, you're basically following Max's footsteps in the piles of goons that he has to go through to get his revenge. But when you're in the nightmare, you're no longer experiencing an event witnessed, but a fragmentary drug-induced nightmare of a tormented man. Gone is the questionable heroics of wiping entire legions of the Italian mob to a man, and in its place is the world that Max has truly, in the deepest recesses of his mind, has inhabited since the fateful day 3 years prior. It's a sad and lonely place where the warmth and light of the world has been extinguished, and the only thing that is left is the wailing and crying of his dead family, always close enough to feel the presence but too far away to ever change anything. As if salvation was to be found on the other side of a door that could never be opened, with the rest of the world a cold and endless abyss. While these sections aren't the great gameplay-wise, they did left a mark on me, and also on a lot of people from playing it back on the PS2 or on the PC all those years back. Hell, there's a lot of people that I talked to that they say that this section is actually pretty scary and it actually upsetted them way back in the day. And it's funny because now it's just so quaint. It's just a little blood trail and baby screaming and Tom having his FOV just too crazy. But it's kind of funny how it is that way. But either ways, now that Max is awake, he's got to go all the way up to the top to the dawn of the Punchinello crime family to see just what the hell is going on. After being drugged by Mona Sachs, Payne seems to find himself wound in an ongoing gang war between Angelo Punchinello and the head of the Russian mob in New York City, Vladimir Lem, who rescues Max from the remains of Lupino's goons to offer him a deal that he can't refuse.
What's this supposed to be? Cops and robbers? Look, you want something with me? Get in line.
Peace, man. Relax. You know you are a real news item, armed and dangerous. I am going to make you an offer you can't refuse. I've always wanted to say that.
It's a bum rap. I've been framed.
That's a moot point. Whatever you did or did not do, I'm sure you had good reason for doing it. Want to hear me out?
I'm listening.
Vlad requires that one of his former men turned traitor needs to die, and with it he will help Max on his quest of vengeance that will take him to the Punchinello residence, which neatly brings Max to the docks in New York City where the hit will take place. The target of the hit is an old-ass cargo ship that is smuggling weapons formerly for the Russian mob, but now for the Italian crime families. Personally, I really like this part of the game since it's a change of pace from the rundown apartments and slums for something a bit more industrial, and also gives us some new weapons and areas to enjoy them, prime of which is the new sniper rifle. What's awesome too is that in this act, or part 2 of the game, there is a lot of jumping around compared to the first act, where you start off at Jack Lupino's hotel, make your way to the docks and the shipping area, and then return to one of Angelo Punchinello's restaurant, which gets blown to smithereens, and finally a final confrontation with Angelo in his manor. But all the while, we're going through the Russian mob, dealing with Finno-Italian goons, and the occasional run-in with a femme fatale. We keep receiving phone calls from one Alfred Woden, a man in the shadows that seems to know Payne's every move and helps him out from time to time, warning him of mobsters headed his way, or the deputy chief of the NYPD, Jim Bravura, who's tailing Payne for what he believes that Max was the one that killed his partner in the DEA, Alex Balder. We'll get to Woden's motives a little later, but for now, all you need to know is that at the heart of the Valkyr case are interested parties that can take things to a level much higher and way deeper than just your run-of-the-mill gangsters like Jack Lupino or his boss Angelo, which at this point we have entered his manor and start the onslaught against his personal bodyguard known as the Trio. And with the Trio defeated, nothing stands in the way of Max getting to Angelo, but the helicopter landing in the front lawn might give us some headache real soon.
Outside my door. Hurry. He's coming for me. You gotta hurry. Please.
I could hear Punchinello on the phone begging for help. He should have been saying his goodbyes. Punchinello was a pushover. The moment I stepped into the room, he folded like a deuce before a royal flush.
No, wait. I was just doing what I was told. I couldn't refuse. She's someone high up. Government, maybe. I don't know.
He was trying to buy more sand for his hourglass. I wasn't selling any.
No, I told him nothing.
Drop it. Don't move.
Game over, Max Payne.
I could tell when I was outgunned. It was time to take another beating. The mystery witch was a real barracuda. Trouble on dagger heels, a smoking assault rifle in her hand, and an army of killer suits behind her.
How sweet. I get to kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
Sooner or later, it was going to catch up with you.
Mr. Payne, it's time to show you the benefits of my brew. Be a good boy now.
You'd find that Lady Luck was really a hooker. You were fresh out of cash.
As the great Qui-Gon Jinn once said, there is always a bigger fish. And the bigger fish that we got into the mouth of this time around is Nicole Horn, the CEO of Aesir Corporation, the pharmaceuticals company, and a familiar voice that we might have heard on the phone before. But with Max surrounded, Don Punchinello dead, and all of the goons going on, the only thing that he can do is get injected with that frickin' syringe and go on another nightmare. But it's at this point in the story that Max starts to understand that there are circles around him that he has no clue of. Secret societies and things well beyond his control that turns this game from a simple like murder revenge sort of noir into a Y2K conspiracy noir for the ages. Part 3 of Max Payne once again has us starting off in Payne's drug-induced nightmare. This time caused by a seemingly lethal dose of Valkyr that has us going through a warped visage of a Payne residence again. But this time around we got some really annoying and shoddy platforming to deal with, though of course not before a little bit of cheeky dialogue.
There was something disturbingly familiar about the letter before me. The handwriting was all pretty curves.
You're in a computer game, Max.
The truth was a burning green crack through my brain, weapon statistics hanging in the air glimpsed out of the corner of my eye, endless repetition of the act of shooting, time slowing down to show off my moves, the paranoid feel of someone controlling my every step. I was in a computer game, funny as hell, it was the most horrible thing I could think of.
Upon waking up in a pile of his own Wallace and vomit, he follows the only clue that was left to him, a reference to a cold steel, which of course is a steel mill in the outskirts of New York City and not the swords and knife manufacturer like my HEMA-damaged brain would have you think. In Cold Steel, we're met with not just the men in suits, but also Aesir Corporation commandos that are loaded to the teeth in guns, which is a great point to remind everyone that now, more than ever, you're gonna want to spam that F5 key every so often, because the firefights in these last final chapters can be brutal as all hell, but still immensely satisfying. The steel mill is just another front for an underground lab known as D6, where it is revealed that Valkyr is a designer drug that formerly was in development by the American Intelligence Services to create soldiers that could feel no pain and have no fear and send them to their myriad foes throughout the world. Though, due to the extreme mental deterioration, the project was cancelled and the materials given to Nicole Horn of Aesir Corporation to make a new drug to distribute amongst the dregs of society. Once Max learns everything that he needs to about Project Valhalla, the Aesir Corp goons set off the self-destruct, and it is up to Max to bust his way out of an exploding D6 and finish some loose ends, though hopefully this exploding D6 is a little less lethal than a certain other D6 in Moscow. First on Max's list of loose ends is BB, who was Max's handler in the DEA that would have been the only one who knew Max and his partner Alex Balder were meeting at Roscoe Street Station at the beginning of the game, which BB so conveniently calls Max to set up a meeting to very obviously ambush Max and tie off the only knowledge connecting Horn, Aesir Corp, and Valkyr together. What follows is a firefight through an entire parking garage, which is probably one of my favorite levels in the game since it has an incredible balance of far-off shooting and up-close and personal firefights, that while once again being balls-to-the-wall difficult in spots, it was still really satisfying, especially when we put one through the eyes of that backstabbing bastard. Alfred Woden soon calls Max and brings him to the Asgard building to reveal the whole spiel to him in regards to the objects of his vendetta, Nicole Horn, the head of Aesir Corp, the inner circle that used to work in Project Valhalla, and how Horn has been blackmailing the inner circle to keep their mouths shut about Valkyr, using some unsavory footage from Jack Lupino's brothel as collateral. Suits bust in, and then most of the inner circle except for Woden dies in a Byzantine power game. And with nowhere left to go, Max is given the detailed schematics to the Aesir Corp headquarters to defeat Horn and fulfill his destiny as a manifestation of Surtur and defeat the Aesir. Yeah, if you didn't get that throughout this entire video or playing the game, yeah, Max Payne is basically a metaphor for Norse mythology, specifically the event of Ragnarok in the twilight of the gods. So before we go on to the narrative, let's talk about all the little itty-bitty connections that you see all along the way that I thought were pretty cool. Alrighty gang, I'm gonna be real in saying that I typically don't really care for Nordic mythology of your Thors and Odins and Valkyries and all that jazz, since it just doesn't really interest me all that much. But Max Payne does the whole Ragnarok cycle in such a subdued and grounded fashion that makes it interesting to me since it's not too on the nose, except for the times when it is. Basically, for those not aware, in Norse mythology, Ragnarok is the final event that preludes to the total destruction of the Aesir, the cosmos, and the rebirth of reality, which is what Max Payne is a metaphor of for the most part, with some parts changed around because why the hell not, and no pun intended on that one. In this cycle, Ragnarok is preluded by a giant-ass winter, which is basically the huge snowstorm that is an ongoing character in the background throughout all of Max Payne, signifying both the beginning of the end and a preview of the mythological fight to come. And within this framework, we see that many of the characters that we see throughout the game are metaphors and allusions to various characters in Norse mythology, starting at the beginning of the game with what actually kicks off the events leading up to the Twilight of the Gods, and that is Loki killing one of the Aesir and Balder, allegedly one of the most beloved of the Aesir, and we see this very clearly with our backstabbing bastard trickster BB killing fellow DEA agent Alex Balder at the beginning of the game on that fateful night at Roscoe Street Station and framing Max and his murder, which sets the immediate events of the game into motion. Central to the events leading up to the beginning of the game is the drug Valkyr, which naturally stands for the Valkyrie, the mythological warrior maiden that will take her strongest chuddies to Valhalla after dying in battle, or, well, maybe overdosing on drugs, I guess. Other ones that are pretty obvious to me are the Asgard building, standing for Asgard, Aesir Corp as the Aesir, the pantheon of the Norse gods, and Ragnarok, which is a very silly play on words for the obvious Ragnarok, which is absolutely a bar and nightclub I've probably been to before, but have been probably so blasted I don't even remember. Jack Lupino, the man who owns Ragnarok, and his connection to Norse mythology takes a little more insight and was more fun to spot out when I eventually started connecting the dots. But basically, for those that don't speak Italian, Lupino essentially means of the wolf, or from the wolf, or even just a wolfie, for it is derived from the Latin lupus, aka the word for wolf. And which figure in Norse mythology could be a wolf that causes a whole lot of problems? Well, Fenrir, of course. And that's what makes Max Payne's connections to Norse mythology so interesting to me, because for somebody who's so uninteresting with all of this stuff to begin with, the personification of Fenrir is not something like weirdly supernatural or shows up like some dumb Nord in Skyrim, but it's just a friggin' Italian junkie high out of his mind trying to evoke the name of Cthulhu. And to cap off, we basically have our big three of Alfred Woden, Nicole Horn, and of course Max Payne. And to start with, the most obvious is Woden, in that he's absolutely supposed to be Odin, what with his one eye, his ability to know and see everything, always calling you and being the head of the inner circle at the beginning of the events of the game. To be honest, out of all of the connections, Woden is the most obvious, but even then, I still think he's an interesting character in his own right. Nicole Horn, on the other hand, took me a little bit to think about, and frankly, I kind of went online to see what everyone else is saying, and there's a pretty convincing theory out there that she is supposed to represent the Gjallarhorn, which is the horn used by Heimdall and Mimir to announce the beginning of Ragnarok. And apart from the name Horn, I didn't really think of it much until I remembered that she is the one that not just sent the junkies to the Payne residence, but also called on the phone to make sure that the hit occurred, putting the entire events of the game into motion and bringing about Ragnarok and the twilight of the gods. And finally, we have our main guy, the man himself, Max Payne, which I found to be quite a bit easier to pin down, since to me, I consider him to be a personification of Surtur. The flame giant that once Ragnarok gets going is the one that will finally bring down Asgard and wipe out the Aesir, which is exactly what Max does throughout the whole game, whether it be going through all of the mobsters and gunning them down like dogs, or taking the fight to the Aesir Corp building and finishing things once and for all. And the thing that I really appreciate about Remedy with Max Payne is that it takes this Norse mythology, something that I don't really care about too much, to be honest, but does it in such a way that is so subdued and not in your face, even though it kind of is on your face, but it's so subdued that it makes just for a really interesting story and gives Max Payne a sort of timeless quality to it. Certainly a lot more of a timeless quality than what some sort of a Garthic seeking teen with those weird little windmills and their videos always like to put in. So with that, we gotta give it off to Remedy for actually making a game about Norse mythology and making it actually kind of cool, at least in my eyes. Regardless, gang, what I really do like about Max Payne is that Max Payne is one of those games that it is both something from my childhood that I absolutely adore, and something that in adulthood I appreciate more and more of, because you get to see all the little connections, you get to see how the game was made and the quaintness of it all, but it's still a really damn good story. So much so that it's like, this copy here, this is not the exact copy, but Max Payne is way better on PC, but to me, in my head, this is still like a PS2 game. This is the worst way to play this damn game, but it's still, to me, like in my head, a PS2 game, because it's just that. That's just how it was. And back in the day, like ages and ages ago, when I was still in elementary school, me and my brother, we'd go to a mutual friend's house to be babysat, basically for a little bit before mom would get out of work. And it's one of those things where this was one of the friggin' games that we played on the PS2. And back then, when we were like 9 and like 6, or 9 and 8, 9 and 7, whatever, like around that age, we had no clue what was going on. It was just a game where the guy made a funny face, and if you threw a Molotov cocktail at a bunch of junkies, they would scream in a really funny way. And so we thought that was funny as hell. We didn't understand that they were junkies, or that they were suffering, or even that a Molotov cocktail is probably a really horrendous way to die. But to us, it was just a funny thing. And so time went on, and that friend and that family had become our family, basically an extension at that point. So if you know, you know. But it's just one of those where, man, oh man, it's what a great game for the winter season, because we get to look back on those things. But anyway, it's time to wrap this freaking baby up and get to the end of Max Payne, because boy, oh boy, it's time to bring on the twilight of the gods. In the final moments of Max's journey, he finds himself in the lobby of the Izir Corp building, with the only thing between him and his sweet, coldly served revenge is an army of Izir security goons and men in suits that are there to protect Horn at all costs. I especially love the beginning to this area because it's a pretty obvious nod to the Matrix, what with Max walking into the building, passing through the security gates, and having the alarm go off, which sets the goons on him, just like at the beginning of one of the final fights in the Matrix where Neo and Trinity go to save Morpheus. After this initial section is when I start really spamming the F5 and E keys over and over and over and over and over and over again, because I kept getting my ass whooped by the security forces. But as it has been with the rest of the time, the gameplay is so genuinely fun and the loading is so short that you just keep retrying over and over again like it's Super Meat Boy, until eventually you make it to Horn's office and penthouse.
Valkyr had been meant to be a white-winged maiden that would lift you to a warrior's heaven, but it turned out to be a one-way demon ride to hell. The devil was in the drug. I knew. I had met him. And now I was gonna kill her, the queen of the underworld who had tried to lift herself a bit closer to heaven with her drug money. No begging, no bribes. She knew better. Honor among killers. We who were about to die. Both of us knew how this would end, in pain and suffering.
All this because your wife stuck her nose into things that were none of her business.
The cops were coming to take me away. The sirens were like a bad conscience I couldn't shake.
It's ridiculous you've made it this far. You won't be alive when they get here.
A final firefight with the goons inside of her lavish as all hell penthouse continues until Payne and Horn take this outside, where the Izir attack helicopter has landed to extract Horn and take her to safety. But with some ingenuity, Payne takes advantage of what is going on outside at the height of the storm to announce the end of the Izir and the twilight of the gods. And with it, it was all over.
Dead. The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger. And then it was all over. The storm seemed to lose its frenzy. The ragged clouds gave way to the stars above.
Max Payne, this is Deputy Chief Jim Bravura from the NYPD. We've got the building surrounded. Throw down your weapons and lie down with your hands behind your head.
A bit closer to heaven.
And that, fellas, was Max Payne, a wonderful Y2K noir detective story that sometimes is ball-bustingly difficult, but regardless, it's still a fun game to play around in the wintertime. It's one of those games that when it's snowing outside, it's a little too cold, you get yourself wrapped up into a blanket, put this damn game into the PS2, but please don't, play it on PC. Put that onto the PC, wrap yourself in that blanket, get some hot cocoa or some coffee in your hand, and enjoy such a wonderful game. After the release of Max Payne, Remedy went on to develop a sequel, Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne, in 2003, and eventually, nearly 10 years later in 2012, we got Max Payne 3, but this time developed by Rockstar themselves, since they were allegedly not pleased with the sales of the second game and decided to give it their best shot themselves. The Fall of Max Payne takes place 2 years after the events of the first game, where Max is back in the NYPD as a detective, and he finds himself reunited with the Goons of New York and Mona Sachs for a different kind of goon in this case, but the story of how that game develops the mythos and the gameplay of Max Payne even further is always, as I say, a story for another day. Thankfully though, Remedy Entertainment continued making incredible interactive experiences that further and further blended mediums to create a series of games that are unlike any other, what with the releases of Alan Wake, Control, and Alan Wake 2 all down the road. Though, if these games look a little too old for you guys, then as of this video, Remedy is developing remakes for the first and second Max Payne games to come out in some sort of bundle, which is rather interesting, but I am left worried what they are going to do with the passing of James McCaffrey, who voices Max Payne. Personally, his voice work is so integral to the character that I don't really know how they would do it without him, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Now, if you're looking to get a little bit more out of Max Payne before you uninstall it, there's actually a bunch of cool mods that you can download for it. One of which is the Kung Fu 3.0 mod that makes you go whoosh, 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 go all over these goons and slap them, protect your neck type stuff. And then the other one is a Katana mod, which is actually a full conversion mod that uses the Kung Fu mod as a baseline, but we'll get into that. Starting with the Kung Fu mod, it's basically Max Payne, but this time around you get to be up close and personal with these goons and launch flying spin kicks at them until they fly out of the room like they're on a wire. And I have to say, having done an entire playthrough of the game with the Kung Fu mod, it was an absolute treat to go through, and I do recommend it. The Katana mod, on the other hand, has the guys developing those mechanics even further by adding in melee weapons like katanas and putting it into its own setting, which, while a bit more difficult since it takes some more getting used to, but if you are looking for a bit more of a graphic experience, then you can blast a few hours away having fun with the Katana mod. But now we have to talk about the availability, and sadly for Max Payne 1 and Max Payne 2, the availability is a bit of a mixed bag. Since for modern systems, you can only really find it on Steam or on Xbox Series consoles through backwards compatibility of the original Xbox copy, but that comes with all of the same issues that console copy did. On Steam, on the other hand, unfortunately, regional availability is a big damn problem with Max Payne and Max Payne 2, with pretty much the entire world not being able to buy it on Steam, and the only relatively lucky people being in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and as far as I can tell, the European Union, which would be incredibly insulting, honestly, if you couldn't buy this game in Finland. But sadly, fellas, that's just how modern Rockstar is these days. Like, just come on, man, take a look at what they did with the Grand Theft Auto games. They just completely murdered them. So with that, I gotta say that Max Payne can be found on Steam for €10 or about 11 Canadian dollars, and roughly around the same price for all the other areas where it is available. As for the areas where it isn't available, well, I guess you always have the Max Payne movie with Mark Wahlberg. And And there you have it, gang. That's pretty much the end of the video. As usual, gang, thank you so much for everybody that made it out this far. It is always wonderful to see every single one of you enjoy one of these vids, and if you're new here, hey, welcome to Tom the Chosen One. I hope you like what you see, and I hope you go and see some of the other stuff that I have made, because I think they're pretty cool. And if you think they're pretty cool, then hey, maybe you should subscribe. That would be pretty awesome. But regardless, gang, man, oh man, Max Payne is just one of those damn games that is something that I grew up loving as a youngin', and now as an adult, it's one of those things that I love it. It's a game that has set into place all of the little things that I love Remedy Entertainment for, and to see them in Max Payne as sort of like this little seed that would eventually grow to the rest of their library, it's pretty crazy. So I love it for that. The story, of course, continues with Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne, game released in 2003 that we will eventually talk about in this program, because I really do want to do all of the Remedy games as retrospectives eventually. But of course, that's a story for another day. When that day comes, though, that's up to you guys, because I don't know if you guys want me to continue right on to Max Payne 2 as maybe the next video, or just something that, you know, we talk about down the road, because there's tons and tons and tons of friggin' games to do retrospectives on. So if you want to know, or just let me know what you think about Max Payne, go down below and, you know, let me know what you think. Let me, you know, leave a little comment saying, hey, yo, make sure you do Max Payne 2, or, you know, or tell me to go blow my head off with a stick of dynamite. I don't know. Leave a comment. I really do appreciate those, and they really do help. I'm just saying. I hate to show these things at the end, but they really do help out. I'm just saying. And with that, gang, I really do gotta wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year for all of the goons out there, because this is the last video of 2025, and the next time we'll see each other will be in the new year, the year of our Lord 2026. So, man, oh man, every year that flies by, it feels like a sci-fi cyberpunk year, and it's bullshit because I'm still driving a 2006 Opel Corsa C. God damn it. That ain't cyberpunk at all, man. It stinks. But hey, life is life, and that's just how it goes. So, with that, gang, we'll see each other next in the top 10 games of 2025. And so with that, I gotta say, I think I might have pissed off the Italian Finno Mafia with all of the shit in this video. So, this is Tom the Chosen One, escaping from my dear life, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey, take it easy.